all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Now, that is a massive, completely audacious claim from Ernest Hemingway. But, when you actually look at the landscape of storytelling before and after the 1880s, you start to see exactly what Hemingway meant. Before Twain, literature it was kind of formal. It was rigid and deeply tied to traditional European styles. But then Twain comes along and he literally shatters all of that, building an entirely new literary foundation using the raw, completely unfiltered voices of ordinary people. Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here because today we're looking at one of the most fascinating, game-changing figures in literary history. We are exploring the colloquial revolution in American literature, spearheaded by none other than Mark Twain. We're going to look closely at how he used everyday language, rich regional dialects, and biting humor to completely reshape how stories were told. He basically dragged the literary world away from flowery romanticism and right into sharp, honest realism. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. First up, we'll cover the father of American literature, followed by the colloquial revolution. Then part 3, youth, river, and race. Fourth, social absurdity and satire, and we'll wrap things up with an enduring legacy. Section 1, Father of American Literature. To really understand this revolution, we first need to understand the revolutionary himself. Before he was an international celebrity, Samuel Clemens was just a young guy with a really singular ambition. He wanted to navigate the treacherous, shifting currents of the Mississippi River. He worked as a steamboat cub pilot, and this was a highly prestigious job, right? It required him to basically memorize thousands of miles of ever-changing river terrain, often in the pitch dark. It was out there on the water that he picked up the jargon of the river. You see, the leadsman's cry for a measured river depth of 2 fathoms, which is 12 feet, meaning the water was safe enough for a steamboat to pass, was Mark Twain. So he adopted this as his pen name. And it's incredibly fitting, because as a writer, he guided his readers through the really deep, often dangerous waters of American society, all while keeping them anchored in the safe water of his irresistible humor. Section 2, the colloquial revolution. So, how exactly did he change the way we read and write? Well, Mark Twain basically became the defining voice of American realism. At the time, literature was heavily influenced by Romanticism. Think idealized heroes, super formal diction, and highly dramatic, often pretty unrealistic plots. Realism rejected that entirely. It was all about depicting contemporary social realities exactly as they were. And the absolutely crucial tool for this? Colloquialism, everyday speech. Twain wrote how ordinary Americans actually spoke, complete with all their grammatical quirks, regional slang, and local rhythms. He didn't sanitize the language for polite society, he just slapped it right there on the page. And this brilliantly illustrates that literary divide. On one side, you had the formal, highly polished, traditional romanticism of writers like James Fenimore Cooper. In fact, Twain famously roasted Cooper in a hilarious satirical essay, just relentlessly mocking his unrealistic plots and stiff, robotic dialogue. On the flip side, you had Twain's rebellious conversational style. He championed what was called a tooth-and-claw realism. He valued concision, precise utility of word choice, and brutal honesty. He proved to the world that you didn't need to sound like some British aristocrat to write a masterpiece, you just needed to sound true. During his most productive years, this approach yielded just an incredible volume of work. Let's look at the timeline. In 1876, he releases The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. 8 years later, we get the sequel that would quite literally change everything, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But he wasn't just a chronicler of the river. In 1889, he publishes this wild, time-traveling satire, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And then in 1894, he gives us Pudd'nhead Wilson. You can really see the evolution here, right? He moves from these nostalgic childhood adventures into increasingly complex, biting social critiques and speculative fiction. Section 3, Youth, River, and Race. Let's dig a bit deeper into the specific themes hidden inside his most famous river-based novels. Twain's brilliance came from writing what he intimately knew. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which was a port town on the Mississippi River before the Civil War. Slavery was illegal and everyday reality there. His years in Hannibal, and later working as a steamboat pilot, gave him the raw material he needed. He essentially transformed his childhood realities, the actual people he knew, and the glaring moral contradictions of his environment into the fictional town of St. Petersburg. He didn't have to invent a world from scratch. He just had to hold a mirror up to the one he had survived.
Now, what's really interesting here is the dramatic thematic evolution between his two most famous works. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is fundamentally a story about youth, adventure, and that sort of funny, harmless rebellion against adult social expectations. It's definitely lighter. But with Huckleberry Finn, Twain shifts gears entirely. Through the eyes of a marginalized, uneducated boy and an enslaved man seeking freedom, Twain dives straight into the heavy stuff: the hypocrisies of mankind, the brutal realities of slavery, and the complex toxic dynamics of race. He brilliantly uses the naive, completely colloquial narration of Huck to expose the absolute absurdity and cruelty of the so-called civilized world around him.
The creation of that masterpiece, however, wasn't exactly a straight line. 400. That is the number of manuscript pages for Huckleberry Finn that Twain wrote in a single, furious burst of inspiration in mid-1876, right after publishing Tom Sawyer. But then, well, he just stopped. He hit a massive wall and ended up shelving the project for years. It actually required him to travel back to the Mississippi River to process how the world was changing around him before he could finally figure out how to finish it in the 1880s. Section 4. Social Absurdity and Satire. But, like we touched on earlier, Twain's genius expanded way beyond the banks of the Mississippi. He was utterly fascinated by science, technology, and alternate history. Did you know he actually spent a lot of time hanging out in the laboratory of his close friend, Nikola Tesla? Pretty wild. In A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, he essentially pioneers the entire time travel trope. He drops a 19th century American straight into Arthurian England just to highlight the absurdities of both historical romanticism and modern political norms. Then, in Pudd'nhead Wilson, he tackles incredibly heavy themes like nature versus nurture and switched racial identities. And get this, he integrates the cutting-edge forensic science of fingerprinting into the plot years before it was standard police practice. A real trailblazer. Because he was so well known as a humorist, Twain had this unique, almost subversive power. He was an incredibly harsh critic of human behavior, acting as a chronicler of the vanities, hypocrisies, and murderous acts of mankind. Later in his life, he became a very prominent anti-imperialist, speaking out forcefully against colonialism, the exploitation of indigenous populations, and systemic cruelty all across the globe. But here's the kicker. Because his language was so accessible, so deeply rooted in the humor of the everyday American, he could deliver these scathing critiques without alienating his massive readership. His humor was essentially his Trojan horse for the truth. Let's move to our final section, an enduring legacy. Mark Twain's life was inexplicably linked to the cosmos, which is just a fascinating detail. He was born shortly after Halley's Comet appeared in 1835, and he famously predicted he would go out with it. Eerily enough, he died of a heart attack in 1910, the very day after the comet made its closest approach to the sun. No way, right? Upon his death, President William Howard Taft summarized his monumental impact perfectly. He said, "His humor was American, but he was nearly as much appreciated by Englishmen and people of other countries. He has made an enduring part of American literature." Twain proved once and for all that a distinctly American voice, speaking in the rough, everyday vernacular of the common people, could command the respect of the entire world. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Mark Twain didn't just write great books, he gave every subsequent generation of writers the permission to write in their true voices. He stripped away the pretense. So I want to leave you with this to chew on. How does the colloquial, rebellious spirit Mark Twain invented continue to shape the way modern American stories, whether that's in books, in movies, or even in the shows we listen to every day, are told today? Next time you read a book with a narrator that sounds like a real, flawed, ordinary person, well, you know exactly who to thank. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.